I'm very excited to introduce Justine Belle Lambright into this conversation about compensation. Justine.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to take a second and move this chair because I kept having these intrusive thoughts while I was in the audience that I was going to start pacing as I am wont to do, and I just pictured myself tripping and falling on my face. But now I feel comfortable, so thank you. And thank you, Miguel, for introducing me. As he said, my name is Justine Belle. I use they, them pronouns. I am originally from Massachusetts, but I move around a lot, and I once lived here in Texas, here in Austin, actually, but I became a real person and my true grown-up self, up to this point, in New York, which is where I live currently. So a little bit more about my background. I come from an industry family. So my parents met while they were working at a restaurant. My dad was the maitre d', my mom was a bartender, so I have had it in my blood forever. And I actually got my start in the restaurant industry working at my uncle's place when I was 12, taking out the trash, and have sort of been in the mix ever since. Since my start in restaurants, I have probably held more than 30 jobs across various positions throughout the entire functioning of a restaurant. So from a porter and a dishwasher, I have shucked oysters, I have bartended, I have managed, I have directed. And each one of those places has its own story, and to that end, there is also a story for why I'm no longer working there and why I'm here talking to you. Those stories and my overall journey is really similar to other people that have worked in the industry. I'm sure a lot of people who are here now today, I have been unpaid, I have been underpaid, I have been overworked to the point of burnout and hospitalization. I have, been lied to with regards to my compensation, whether it be my actual hours in direct wage theft or, being told that there would be some kind of incentive or bonus for meeting targets for reaching a certain length of time participating, in an organization. And I can tell you that anytime I have been promised a bonus, I have not gotten it. And I remember every single time, and one day I will get my money. And not to mention, I have also been laid off more times than I can count on one hand with zero notice and zero regard to my personal well-being or my family or, just what would happen to me afterwards. The list could go on. The list could go on forever. But with this time that we have together right now, I really hope to name some of the patterns that I have seen throughout this time that I have spent in restaurants. I am 33 years old and have 21 years of restaurant experience, so I think that ratio is pretty good in relation to the rest of the people in the industry, so I'm gonna consider myself an elder. We're all family. I'm gonna give you a little advice. What I hope to do is to just talk about, beyond just naming the toxicity, naming these patterns, also just after doing research, some of which has been brought up earlier today, naming, the history of some of these, just some of these patterns and discuss healthier and more equitable ways that we can move forward as an industry. So I'm gonna start with the past. And so just really quickly, it was mentioned in the last panel, but just the global and domestic history of tipping. So it originated in Europe, and it originated during the feudalist Middle Ages. And so basically this was a way for, the masters of the house to incentivize good service, happy workers, that sort of thing. So these people weren't being paid actual wages because they were owned, pretty much. And so this was a way that people could ensure, more opportunity for their family. This custom was changed with the abolition of the feudal system, but that power dynamic shifted from masters and their servants onto guests and or consumers and workers. So you started seeing these in like taverns and pubs and whatnot in Europe. And then in the 1800s, when global travel became a lot more popular and more accessible for wealthy Americans, and at the same time, running parallel, there was also a mass exodus from Europe of poor immigrants to the United States. This idea and this concept of tipping started to be reflected in the US, or whatever it was at the time, US, blah, 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 stolen land, none of it matters. So really quick to backtrack, the title of, this speech, this presentation is compensation in the industry, but I will be focusing a lot on tips specifically, even though that isn't necessarily the way that all of us are compensated. But I want to really put my finger on that topic, because that sort of power dynamic that gets played out is reflected in a lot of other areas of business. So we're talking about this through the restaurant lens, but hopefully by the end of this, I'll have drawn parallels to other aspects and how we can move forward and compensate people more fairly, more transparently, all of that. So to get back into it. Tips, the idea of it got to America, and there was massive negative backlash. Nobody wanted tips. Nobody wanted a tipping system. And this is partially because we had just gotten out from under the foot of Great Britain, and people were like, this is some monarchy shit. Like, this looks really familiar to what we were doing before. This is from Europe. We are trying to not be Europe. We don't want to see this. We don't want to pay people like this. There's a quote from the journalist Nina Martiris saying that people in the States found it distasteful. They, found it un-American. They found it to be something that was supporting the monarchy. I'm going to pull up the full quote really quickly. But basically, there was this whole movement of rich people, specifically against tipping. One of those people is Anne Morgan, the daughter of J.P. Morgan and the long deceased relative of one Sonia Morgan of Real Housewives of New York fame. Very important. So Nina Martiris said that, people found it distasteful and un-American because it was feudal. When you give a tip, you establish a caste system. By tipping someone, you render them your inferior, your moral inferior, your class inferior, your social and economic inferior. So it was a caste-bound system, and it was an old world custom, and it reeked of feudalism. It was called servile, it was called a bribe, it was called a moral malady, blackmail, flunkyism, and people in large numbers rallied against it. Now, this anger was very short-lived because shortly thereafter, we had the end of the American Civil War. And so at that point, there was a massive volume of newly freed people who were without property, without education, without jobs. And so restaurant owners at that time found a massive opportunity to not have to pay people, and also have, a desperate labor force. So if I was going to paint a picture for you, these restaurant owners, realized that they were able to allow their guests to cosplay the feeling of, or the experience of having a family servant. And people got off on that shit. They loved it. They were like, you're telling me that I can go into this place and based off of how nice someone is to me, I can determine the price of my meal? Fantastic. And of course that does, in theory sounds great. Oh, I can choose how much I'm paying. I can choose how much, and I can also incentivize this person to be really nice to me and make me feel really important and make me feel really special through these tips. This then sort of transcended other aspects of the economy. One of the first companies that really optimized on this was the Pullman Car Company. So they had a system of trains throughout the country. And the founder, George Pullman, is quoted as saying that the plantation has more or less trained them being formerly enslaved people, to be pleasing to the customer. And, during one of the conversations earlier, I thought it was really interesting that we were talking about this concept of working in a restaurant as being a body, being someone who is there, who is fulfilling a need. But when I have had many experiences where, I've gone to work and I don't feel like anyone cares whether or not I have a brain. They just care that I showed up. They don't care if I'm sick or not. They don't care if I am in my right mind space or not. They just care that my body is there and that I put on a smile for the customers. And fast forward 157 years, and this system has barely changed. And I think that that's something that we're coming to terms with in a lot of areas in our society, that we have been extremely complacent in the systems that were established by people that do not reflect our current population. And they didn't reflect the population then, but now people are getting loud, and I am one of them. Thanks. I think it's really important to note that we cannot divest the history of servitude from the service industry. It is literally right there in the name. And I think it's important to talk and sort of delve more into this power dynamic between the guest, the business owner, and not only the people that work on the floor, but also middle managers. It can seem a lot of the times when you're working in a restaurant that the manager, they're the person that's writing you for your time card, and they're the one that's, on you to take your breaks and doing all of these things. But at the end of the day, they are just as subjugated as people on the floor, and they're typically getting paid less. So I think that, even though with that title, it is important that that title doesn't necessarily equate to power. So I'm going to pull up some statistics really quickly. In the United States, the national median salary is $69,000 or $69,717. In the United States, the national median salary for a server is $39,737, which is 57% of the national average. So, reminder that these are the salaries that people make, not that they take home. And so I did the math out. And so to put this into perspective, as a person filing as a single taxpayer in New York City, roughly 24% of your paycheck is taxes and taken out before it comes home. So that take-home check would be closer to $29,000. Maybe $30,000, which is $575 a week or $2,300 a month. The national average for monthly expenditures, for housing, it's $1,700. For food monthly, it's $691. And for insurance and pension, it's $656. So we haven't even tapped into anything beyond a roof and food and staying healthy, and we are already $400 over our budget every month. And this isn't even taking into account student loan debt. It's not taking into account, any sort of health or doctor debt that comes on top of that, because insurance does not pay for anything. It doesn't take into account any sort of emergencies, and it doesn't take into account any fun. This would literally be you going to work every day, going home and just walking around every inch of the apartment that you have because you paid for it and you can't afford anything else. So you're going to just get your money's worth. And, just like the idea of being tapped out on your budget before, having the chance to do anything, it's bleak. It's fucking bleak, y'all. And so like all of this is also assuming that this server in question is making steady tips. Like this is assuming that that person has a consistent paycheck, which is not something that is guaranteed in service. So the question that I found myself asking while I was putting this together is like, why is all of that risk being put on people that have the least amount of safety net beneath them, socially, financially, what have you? And then also who deserves to carry that risk? And I also have some prepared questions. In prepping for this, I was like getting really nervous. One, that I wouldn't have enough things to talk about, which like, LOL, have you met me? But like also that maybe I wasn't going to fit everything in, or that like I wasn't going to like hit all the topics I wanted to. So I went to my community, I talked to people, and there were some questions that kept coming up that I wanted to address. So the first question is like, well, servers that I know make a lot of money. Wouldn't this be a pay decrease for most of them? And granted, again, I live in New York. So people do make more money there. People can make more money there. But like, yes, of course, there are some people who are able to make complete bank from tips. But those aren't necessarily the people that we're talking about, right? We're not necessarily talking about the people who have the privilege to live in a city. It doesn't always feel like that when you're walking around during the summer in sandals and a rat runs across the top of your foot, but like living in New York is a privilege. And so not all servers live in a city. We're not talking about the person who works at, EMP. We're not talking about the person that worked at NOMA. We're not talking about the person that worked, wherever. We're talking about someone who lives in like Tuskegee, who has worked at Waffle House for 30 years, who has no health insurance, who isn't able to save, who has no retirement plan, and will have to work themselves until they can't stand anymore. Like those are the people that we're actually talking about when we're having this conversation. And so like, is it really fair for that person to carry the risk of a massive national franchise? I personally don't think so. And so to go back to NOMA, I mentioned that, obviously that's not in New York. For those of you who don't know, this is a Scandinavian restaurant of many Michelin stars. And they went into a no tipping system, and shortly thereafter, a couple years thereafter, they decided to close. And there was all of this fanfare coming, from across the industry, from, across the world, from people that didn't even have any stake in the restaurant game, saying, see, we need to tip people. We need to keep this system. We need, there's no incentive for people to have restaurants open. Like, it's impossible to pay people what it actually takes, to run a restaurant. It's like, well, then maybe you shouldn't open a business. Like, if you can't afford it, then don't do it. If you can't afford to pay people, what it takes to pay their bills and to be housed and to be clothed consistently, then you do not deserve to own a business, period. And it's not about tips. It's not about, social standing or anything like that. It's like, we need to figure out how to make this industry work while compensating every single person fairly. And if we can't, then we need to just start opening up luncheonettes with like counters and stuff like that and figure out another way to employ people, because it ain't working. So to go back to these questions that I was asking myself while talking in circles, let's see, how's everyone doing today? Me too. So another question, like besides the NOMA thing, besides, all of that, it was like, what is the other option? If we're not tipping people, like, do the prices go up? Does the price of food go up? Like, how do we mitigate these costs from the customer's pocket? And my like question in response to that is like, well, like, what else was that person going to do for food if they didn't come in here? They would probably cook for themselves. It probably wouldn't be as good as the experience at the restaurant. They wouldn't be served. They wouldn't be taken care of. They'd have to do their own dishes, buy their own groceries, make their own drinks. And we're talking about opportunity cost here. So it's like, you can figure out a way to do that without having to pay gratuity, and but you will still pay. You will pay or you will pay. And so it's like, are you paying in time or are you paying in like actual money? So this idea of risk, I think, also translates to the recurring theme that we've been seeing throughout the day of like power and where power is held and who has that. And so a lot of the times people that like are able to get service jobs, like Chris was saying, it is a job that you can get with little education, little experience. You can work your way up and you can find ways to make more money within that system. And yes, currently that can be through tips from like, jumping around from place to place or from specializing. But, we were having this conversation last night about like what it means to be poor and how it feels as a poor person, and like what options, what paths that you have. And so as someone who has exclusively lived paycheck to paycheck, and I have experienced poverty in my life, I have felt that being poor, there's like the poor where you hustle, which is what I'm in right now, where like I'm working multiple jobs, working my ass off, paying my bills, but like I would love to have some softness in my life. And like that rest feels like a privilege that I can't afford. There is poor and desperate, where you will literally do whatever it takes. Like no matter what, if it compromises your personal safety, your long-term wellness, your reputation, you will do whatever it takes because that is how far gone you are. And then there's also, a time of like poor acceptance that I've experienced where it's like, this is my station, this is what I deserve, or this is what I was born into. And like, what is the point in putting more effort in? Because like, this is where I'm at. Let me accept the cards that I was dealt. And that just sucks, man. It sucks. And so how do we shift this power? How do we give people the means to create power for themselves? And, in preparing for this, like thinking about the term empowerment, how do we empower people? Access. That's something that we've been talking about a lot today. That is one of the main themes of this conference, is access and inclusivity. But something else that has come up a lot is a community mindset. And so I think that a lot of what we've been talking about on the risk side of things, it's risk from a company that is being put on an individual. And so it's how do we turn individuals into an organization that are able to collectively leverage that power and demand what it is that they deserve. So in terms of businesses that are, community minded, currently the examples are sort of few and far between. A lot of them are here in this room today, and I'm so thankful. But in general, throughout the landscape, your options are starting a socially minded business, which like isn't necessarily an attractive investment. And, we're talking about poor people with maybe not a lot of power. And so it's like, how are those people going to get investment? They're not independently wealthy. They can't start it on their own. And, these investors are really, really quick to throw a ton of money on like a concept or an app or something like that that won't actually provide any social good and could very well, and like statistically probably will fail in the next 5 years. So, Silicon Valley Bank could be a whole speech in and of itself. But, people are able to give away millions and millions of dollars to ideas that will profit them even more and give them more money that they can invest in more ideas like this. And so it's like, how do we incentivize people to invest in social good? And then another option that I want to talk about is business conversion. I'm going to just graze over this really quickly. But there is an upcoming opportunity globally that economists are calling the silver tsunami. And so basically, this is referring to the large amount of baby boomer age folks that will soon be of retirement age. There was a New York Times article that came out last week that talked about where wealth is held in the United States, and more than 50% of land and wealth is held by people of that generation. So we are coming upon a time where this land, these companies, this wealth is going to be in flux. And if we don't establish or talk about ways forward, there's going to be a power vacuum. And so like maybe there will be more investors who come in who are even more driven by the bottom line, who are more divested from workers' rights, who are more, divested from community well-being. And I'm scared for what that could possibly look like. So now is the time that we should discuss employee ownership, business conversions, alternative business models. There's something to be said of the case of Patagonia being sold to the environment and versus Astor Wines that was sold to its employees. A lot of times the transferring of business power is really transferring from, one evil to another evil. Patagonia said that they sold to the environment. They didn't. They sold to, or they donated themselves to environmental charities that are just going to hold up the same agenda of these billionaires. What do we do? What do we do? My business, our worker cooperative was founded to try and workshop a better solution. At the time, the pandemic was going on. One of my business partners, Grace, and I were working at a company. A lot of things happened. It was not good. We got laid off, and we were like, we could do this. We could replicate this. We could make something like this happen for us. And at that same time, there was a collective effort going on in Burlington, Vermont. There was a community purchase of a house. There were 20 or so people that came together, pooled their money, and bought a 3-story house on Oak Street. And that was then converted into a day business, a night business, and a bakery. That would work on the days that the restaurants were closed. And we saw that, and we were like, that. We don't know exactly what that is, but whatever that is, that feels really good, and it feels really safe, and it feels really inspiring. And so the reason why I'm here and why I wanted to name these things and talk about these systems is I want to pay this information forward, that there are ways of breaking out of these cycles, and there are ways of reclaiming power as a worker. And, find me after this. I love talking about solidarity economics. And, sort of what we were saying in the last panel, each one teach one. It is our job, if we find something that could change people's lives, I'm not going to gatekeep. I'm not going to keep it to myself. I think that everyone in here should do a little research on solidarity economics. So just really quickly, the main theme of this term is social profitability over immediate financial profit. So we're playing the long game. With the winery that we've established, we have this thing called Transparency Tuesdays where, we've sort of dropped off on it, but we would go in and just show like what goes into making a bottle of wine. Like, here's how much money goes into the actual grapes. Here's what a bottle costs, a label, the labor, labeling, corking, like doing the wax, driving it to the market, actually selling at the market, having to lug that stuff back to the winery. Like, all of those things go into the cost of a bottle. Our prices are a little bit higher than a traditional winery, but it's because all of that money is going to the local businesses that we buy from. It is going to pay for the gas in our car. It is going to literally getting us in front of people in situations like this one to talk about why it's important to prioritize each other and prioritize our communities. So, to circle back to the history of tipping and these power dynamics that we're seeing play out in this industry and in our society, I think it is time for us all to come together as a community and realize that we are done with kings, we are done with masters, and the only people that can help us are ourselves. Thanks.